Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Looks like we're going to have a small group today, which is fine. My name is David Holt. I'm the Senior Research Law Librarian at UC Davis School of Law. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the geography of California, we're right between San Francisco and Sacramento. I've been at UC Davis for about 7 years now. Prior to that, I was at the Federal Judiciary and then at Santa Clara Law for about 11 years. So I'll be celebrating my 20th year of doing legal reference work next year, which I'm excited to celebrate. But today's presentation is going to be on pedagogical strategies and tech tools for English language learners. And so what I have learned over the last about 5 years now, since I was invited to participate in the LLM program, how we can shape our curricula to accommodate the needs of English language learners, and how these students can present some challenges in the classroom that perhaps are fairly unique for this student group. So again, my target audience here are LLM students that are in a generalized program. We don't offer specialized LLM programs at UC Davis. It's all a generalized LLM program. And this is often their first introduction to US law and to legal research. For the vast majority of them, this is also their first introduction to instruction in English. Some challenges that we may face with English language learners include that they are now exposed to a new vocabulary, some of which is in Latin, to make matters even more complicated. This takes up space in working memory, and we're going to talk about cognitive neuroscience and how cognitive neuroscience informs how we approach instructing English language learners in a classroom. And we'll see how that learning in a second language, or while you're acquiring a second language, can take up space in that working memory, which can exacerbate cognitive inefficiency. This may also be the first time that students have been exposed to novel approaches compared to their home countries. In many other jurisdictions, foreign jurisdictions, there's a very simple lecturing format that is utilized. In the United States, of course, we have a Socratic method, and now we're getting into a flipped classroom as well. I know that's a term that we've discussed ad nauseum at conferences, a flipped classroom, but I am going to talk about how flipping a classroom can help accommodate these English language learners. Before I jump into the cognitive neuroscience and the pedagogical strategies, I want to talk a little about the major sources that I've utilized to educate myself on this topic. And I really would like to highlight two major titles that are authored by the same law professor. He teaches in a law school in Hong Kong, and he has written two books. The first, The Art of Law Teaching, and the second, Flipped Classrooms for Legal Education. The Art of Law Teaching was really helpful in my journey as an LLM instructor, in that he described what he calls deep learning. And deep learning is the ability to understand material for themselves, to critically engage, to link previously introduced knowledge and experience, to really contextualize some of the content that we are teaching in a legal research classroom. Likewise, the second book that he has authored, Flipped Classrooms for Legal Education, goes into the advantages of a flipped classroom and flipped instruction. We have often been using what is called the Socratic method in law school classrooms, where there is active engagement. Students are actively engaging with students, with professors rather, but there may be an overemphasis on cases compared to practical skills training. This is the Langdale casebook method. And it fosters monopolization of discussion by a few students. And it also does not provide sufficient guidance to students on what is expected of them. In contrast, flipped instruction offers vicarious learning and self-teaching, and perhaps most importantly, it offers active mimicry of legal practice. I would be amiss to not mention the material that I have received from both the Teaching the Teachers Conference, which is a small conference that educates law librarians on legal research pedagogy. And also I've heavily relied on research from Allison Drake, who's the head of instruction at the University of Houston. If you're interested in the topic of cognitive neuroscience and legal research pedagogy, I highly recommend her work. She is a well-known national expert on this topic. So let's talk about cognitive neuroscience and how it can inform our pedagogical strategies here. For one, there's the human information processing model, which is broken up into three parts or stages. The first is your sensory memory, and that's the impression that you receive from your senses of everything that is surrounding you. Then we have short-term or working memory. And what we have learned in cognitive neuroscience research is that a typical student can only hold 4 chunks of information in short-term memory that they need to immediately rehearse within 30 seconds after introduction. Otherwise, that may not get encoded into long-term memory. And so how we define a chunk, of course, is a little ambiguous here. Obviously, it depends on the content that's being presented. But I want to highlight the importance of rehearsal. We need to both contextualize the content that we're teaching, and we need to give students the opportunity to rehearse that content almost immediately after introduction. The third stage there is long-term memory, where that content has been deeply ingrained and a student is able to recall that, to contextualize it, to apply it to other fact patterns. Cognitive load is another area of cognitive neuroscience that is applicable to our work. In cognitive load, we have intrinsic load, which is the inherent difficulty of the material. There's the germane load, which is the subset of intrinsic load that working memory must use to develop long-term memory. And then you have your extraneous load, which is your unnecessary or distracting info. One goal that we have in presenting a legal research curriculum is to reduce that cognitive load. We want to be able to break those curriculum, the content that we're teaching into smaller chunks so that students are able to encode that into long-term memory and are able to immediately rehearse that. So how do we reduce cognitive load? Again, we can break up the content into as small chunks as possible. We can connect to real-world scenarios, so perhaps larger fact patterns rather than treasure hunt type exercises. And I know we've kind of used that as a term of art, treasure hunt type exercises within law librarianship. If you're giving a student the task to locate the definition of murder in a legal encyclopedia, I would consider that to be a treasure hunt type exercise. There's no real-world fact pattern that you are contextualizing. You're simply asking the student to locate a relevant section in the source that answers the very simple research question. We then want to contextualize that content, and so connect present content to what was previously covered in class, and then to repeat that content. And I know this makes for perhaps a boring presentation or a boring instructional opportunity, but there's actual cognitive neuroscience evidence backing up the idea that both repeating your content and even reading from your slides, I know that's anathema to most of us, isn't it? Reading from your slides, there's actually some evidence that reading from your slides has some pedagogical advantages, which came as a surprise to me, and I probably as a surprise to many of you, but there's evidence to back that up. My colleague is going to be talking about formative assessments with English language learners, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but they should be done frequently throughout a course. These assessments can be short quizzes that are immediately applicable to the content covered and provide instant feedback. You don't want to do a formative assessment and then wait several days or a week later to give feedback. If you can build that into your learning management system, your LMS, to provide instant feedback, that's even perhaps preferred. And they should be low stake. What I have done in my LLM legal research course, or when I'm teaching ALR or even first year students, is I will make an exercise required but not graded. And so students are expected to complete the work, and they will get feedback, either instant feedback because I have built in a response into the LMS, or I provide a response directly to the student, but they don't get graded for that response. And so it's a low stakes exercise. So from theory to praxis, how do we apply this to legal research pedagogy? Again, we're going to use real-world examples immediately following the introduction of content. We will utilize formative assessments to provide that immediate rehearsal so that students can rehearse that content and then encode that into long-term memory. Normalize the idea of learning new terms. This is particularly important, obviously, with English language learners. Much of what they're learning in the classroom includes new terms that they're unfamiliar with. Introduce a resource and then immediately repeat how to apply it to a fact pattern. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Reduce extraneous load by keeping your slides concise and brief. I know sometimes we want to make our presentations very interactive or snazzy. I remember there was a trend to use Prezi a few years ago. Remember that when we were using Prezi? I would consider that to be extraneous load that is taking away from the content that you're trying to teach. And again, reading from your slides is actually okay. As shocking as that may be, there's some evidence to behind that. So what does this actually look like in practice? I've talked a lot about reducing cognitive load and having the ability to rehearse content immediately after introduction. What does that actually look like in an LMS and a learning management system? This is a screen shot from Canvas, and you can see that I have flipped my classroom. And so I have recorded a lecture that I've uploaded to YouTube. And the reason why I've selected YouTube is because of the automatic closed captioning. And you'll often find, particularly among English language learners, that their reading ability is far higher than their speaking ability. And this is true for second language acquisition in general. People learn to read text in a foreign language much earlier in the process. They're able to do that more competently than they're able to carry on a conversation with a in that foreign language. And so I have flipped my classroom onto YouTube so students are able to watch that lecture. Now, it's not a 45-minute lecture because that is simply too long for a lecture in a flipped classroom. I try to keep that around 15 or 20 minutes for a flipped lecture. And then as soon as they return to class, they've watched that recording. I repeat the content covered in the lecture, and then we'll do a quiz throughout the class time. And I try to avoid excessive use of those treasure hunt type exercises by contextualizing the content I'm teaching in larger fact patterns. Another idea that I would like to emphasize here is the concept of transparent assignment design. And this is really interesting that students often don't know what an A looks like, and they really should. They should know when they submit their assignment, they should have a general idea as to whether they did well on the assignment or not. And that's a part of what is called transparent assignment design. In transparent assignment design, you make the why, how, and what easily accessible to students. So what does an A look like? You may want to present an A paper as an example to your students from another fact pattern. obviously not the same fact pattern, but from another fact pattern, so that they know what an informal research memo would look like. I've tried to keep things as simple as I possibly can in my LLM class. Again, these are students that have no exposure to the American legal system or to a formal US legal education. And so I try to keep things as very simple as I can. And what I have done is for these larger fact patterns, I try to mimic an informal email transaction with their supervising attorney. It is a mimic of a real world scenario here, something that they as an extern or as a first-year associate may encounter, where their supervising attorney has asked them to respond with an informal research memo via email. Students are often flummoxed. My students were often flummoxed as to what an informal research memo should look like. So you need to give them an example of that. You need to make your assignments as transparent as possible, and also contextualize how that assignment is actually applied to practice. Having said that, I'd like to switch gears rather dramatically now and talk about some helpful tech tools that English language learners may find helpful in their journey through an LLM program or through a JD program, if that's where they're enrolled. For one, we have grammar checkers. And I'm sure you're familiar with Grammarly already, but there is a second grammar checker called WordRake that I highly recommend. It is well suited for legal writing, and it aims for brevity. And it's a way to make your writing more concise, more pithy, and it's very effective. It's $17 a month. It's a little more expensive than Grammarly. And you're going to find that a lot of these tools are going to be incorporating generative AI elements very soon. In fact, generative AI as a language learning tool is an avenue that is going to emerge within the next year or so. We already have some tools at our disposal here that can be used for second language acquisition that incorporate generative AI. There's Duolingo Max, which is $30 a month, and it uses ChatGPT to create role-playing exercises. And there's also a ChatGPT variant called Practica that mimics an English tutor, and it's $8 a month. It's pretty interesting. I don't know how effective this. I don't hold myself out to be an expert on second language acquisition, so I don't know how effective these tools are going to be in terms of actually assisting English language learners in a legal classroom, but they do present some interesting options down the road, and we're going to see definitely some work done in this arena. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague here.
Good afternoon to those here and to those online. I'm Dana Raigrodski. I'm a faculty member here. And let me find my slides. Here we go. Okay, so thank you, David. I really appreciated it. If we have time in Q&A, I definitely have some thoughts on some of those things. One of the classes that I teach and a large constituency of students that I work with are foreign trained attorneys. Most are second language learner in English. Many of them, in fact, speak 3 and 4 languages. But we also have students that have their law degree from outside the US, but have made their center of life in the US. So English may not be as much of an issue, but they're still taking those classes and learning the legal system anew. So what I thought I would talk about today is not so much formative assessment versus summative assessment, one, because I know you all know more than I do, and two, because I am definitely a big believer in formative assessments, in mixing, both. To me, it ties directly with the various ABA standards, whether it's the professional identity formation standard, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging standards. Because I've been working for so many years with learners at different stages in life, professionally, geographically, culturally, racially, ethnically, really from all walks of lives, both in the JD and in our graduate programs, our LLM and our MJ programs, and PhD. For me, it's really a way to ensure that I'm trying to reach out to different learning styles and to multiple learners so that they can have as much of a productive experience and occasionally enjoyable experience. But what I really wanted to maybe highlight a little bit more today is an inadvertent experiment that I conducted this past winter when I was teaching a business organizations course at UW Law. It is a required class. It's a required upper level class. The majority of the students, I'll talk more about that, were actually JD students. And it had some interesting, as I said, it was an experiment. So we'll talk about that in a second. So by way of overview, I have a pretty diverse portfolio of classes that I teach. I've been teaching the required, the equivalent of LARW, Legal Analysis, Research and Writing, the 1L course for the foreign trained LLM, similar to the class that David teaches. For us, it's a 1/4 class that crams in the research and the writing and the analysis. So it's fun. Definitely lots of assignments throughout the course, both research assignments and writing assignments. I actually have gone back on the low-stake non-graded assignments because the students end up putting so much time and effort into all of this that I feel that they should at least get some points for it. But we do vary it. So on the research exercises that we do at the beginning, those are typically in-class group exercises, and they each have to submit individually, and it's 3 points, right? It's something very relatively low stakes. By the time we get to the memos, there's no collaboration allowed. But again, they submit it, they get feedback from me, there's rubrics, examples, all of the good stuff that David was talking about. I also teach a variety of upper-level seminars, again, to students in all of our programs. And in all of those, I often incorporate short writing assignments, which are typically more of a check-in and accountability type of assignment. So in my globalization seminar or in my feminist jurisprudence seminar, I'll have the students submit short, 750 words, reflection essays where they summarize the main arguments in the reading, and then they give me a brief critique or perspective on it. It also helps set them up for their final research assignments and research papers. But those are, and those are graded, but again, they are, I have firm due dates, right? For the legal research and writing class, the due dates are pretty firm because we have sequencing issues and I need to be able to give them feedback. So there's really very little flexibility, the occasional ad hoc adjustments, obviously. With the upper level seminars, again, I set due dates mostly because if I'm going to be talking about that reading and my slides are pretty detailed, I want to make sure that they've actually read it, right? And they're pulling the summary on their own rather than just picking up bullet points from my slides. So the due dates are fairly firm. For a few years, I taught we had a required 1L doctrinal course in transnational law. And for that one, I did utilize Canvas quizzes. I don't like having everything right on one big, large final exam. So I figured we might as well do quizzes during. We also do a lot of group work in the classroom, but for the quizzes that were on Canvas, for the 1L class at the time, the due dates were strict due dates, right? They had to complete them by a certain date. And it was fine, but we've been having conversations amongst our own faculty and our staff and librarians about choice, right? That students claim that they want choice. And that we should be treating our students as the adult individuals that they are, as the budding professionals that they are. And, in real life, granted, I'm a procrastinator, and unless I have a deadline, nothing ever gets done. So I'm not sure why I thought that students should get choice, but that being said, again, thinking about making my classroom inclusive, acknowledging that people are balancing work-life and they have multiple courses, not just my courses, I decided with the required business organization course this past winter to play around with things and do it a little differently. So again, for us, BizOrgs is it's required for the JDs. It's not required for the LLMs and the MJs. It's a required upper level course for the JDs. I had 48 students, 32 Ls, 15 3Ls, 3 that were from the LLM and the MJ program. The grading was divided into the 10% participation points. I do like participation points. And I do base them primarily on the group work in the classroom. So yes, some people are probably getting by, but hey, that's okay. Well, I assure you that some of them are probably getting those just by showing up. But hey, quizzes, I had 3 quizzes, 10 points each. For a total of 30%, and then a final exam, which in my case was, short response, short fact pattern, but then broken down to targeted questions and short responses. So the quizzes, I said there were 3 quizzes, each was worth 10 points. Each was composed of 10 questions, a combination of multiple choice, multiple answer, and true false. It was administered via Canvas. It was graded automatically, scored automatically on Canvas. I used to have the kind of fill the blanks or open-ended questions on those. And then it's like, I still have to grade this. So what's the point? So I've shifted to the ones that Canvas can auto score. Each quiz was time limited to 30 minutes. Students had 2 tries. The highest score was kept. So it is technically summative, right? But it had some aspects of it, which at least in my eyes are formative. I'm sure any educational professional is probably disagreeing with me. And then in full disclosure, I did end up adjusting at the end of the quarter for 1 or 2 questions that were, bad questions, right? That confused more students. So I corrected those grades on that. Each quiz was available to take on a self-scheduled basis within a designated period. So for example, for quiz 1, which was published on January 16, I said, this is a review quiz of chapters 1 to 4. It's recommended that you complete it no later than January 21st. Right? But there's no firm due date. So students knew going in that there's no firm due date, but I told them what's the coverage and what I recommend that they, by which date I recommend that they complete the quiz. Again, each quiz focused primarily on materials covered between the quizzes. And it was intended to give both the students and myself a sense of where they are, right? Business organizations is not the easiest subject matter. Students are there. Some of them were there because they wanted to. Most of them were there because it was required, right? And, I looked at the student evaluations like, why do I need to be in here? I want to do public interest service. But anyway, so the idea was that I, as well as the students, will be able to know early on where they stand, right? In all of my other classes where I have a lot of written assignments, and when I'm giving individual feedback to students, I can see, right? So if someone is struggling, if they're not coming to me, I am coming to them, right? So they really, for the most part, cannot escape. And hopefully I'm setting them up for success, who knows? So I thought students would, for the most part, follow what I suggested, use the opportunity to go, yeah, I know, right? You know already where this is going. This was destined to fail from the get-go, right? So I thought, okay, students would want to know that they have all their, let's say, potentially 40 points before they go into the final exam so that they see which areas maybe they are struggling with. And all of my lectures are recorded. I publish the slides ahead of class so that students can actually have it. Again, it's a matter of ensuring that students that have learning constraints, right, whether it's hearing or visual or anything else, or language for that matter, have the material in front of them. They get the slides with my notes. so that they can really engage in the classroom. So I thought students would take advantage of that, but I was wrong. Well, they took advantage of the fact that the due dates were not set, let's say that way. Okay, so here are the quiz statistics, and okay, on the big screen, you can actually see it better than I'm seeing it here. As a general matter, you see that students didn't really need the entire time, right? Most of those quizzes were a quick in and out. They were directly related to things that were in the materials, in the slides. It was open book. Again, it was intended as a review. It was intended as a checking point. And most students did very well. But when it came to when they took the quizzes, it really varied. So you see that with the first quiz, which I recommended they take no later than January 21st, which was about, I don't know, for us, 2-3 weeks into the quarter, right? So 23 students out of the 48 completed it by the due dates. 14 students completed it within the week following, right? So still more or less on target, although we've moved on to other materials. So I would say about half of the class, more than half of the class. 4 students completed it a little later. The second quiz is already nipping on their heels. And then 7 students didn't complete, I can tell you already, didn't complete any quiz until we actually basically finished the quarter. I know Carla is looking at me, it's like, what is going on here? Okay, so 7 students completed after our last class, which was also our review class, and during exam week, up to literally like the last day of exam week. I'm guessing they didn't take the BizOrgs exam just yet. I did actually on January 22nd send the class an announcement that says, for those who didn't yet get to quiz 1, I encourage you not to wait much longer. These are intended to give you and me a sense of where you are with the materials long before the main final exam, right? So I was prompting them to try and complete it more or less in a timely manner. By the time we get to quiz 2, so now, as you can see, the number of students that decided to push it to the end of the quarter doubled, right? The same original 7 plus another 8. Again, 21 students completed by the recommended date, 12 students completed in the few weeks after that. February 27th is when I published the last quiz, right? So at that point, they still had time. Again, we moved to other materials in the classroom. And then 15 students, as I pointed out, opted to do it later on. And then we get to quiz number 3. Guess where we are? Any guesses? I'm taking any bets. Yeah. So by the time we get to quiz number 3, now I will say the due date for quiz number 3 was basically the end of the quarter, right? But still, majority of students actually waited and did it during exam week for some bizarre reason, right? So it didn't quite work the way that I intended. One of the challenges that actually created for me was I wasn't able to then go, once they did their 2 tries, right? Or once they finished their grading, their quiz, they saw the right answers. But I didn't have the opportunity to discuss those questions in the class because I still had students outstanding with the quizzes. So I think that was a missed opportunity a little bit. Now, I will say the textbook that I've used had not only a lot of fact patterns and hypos inside the chapters, which we diligently did in class and discussed in class. At the end of each chapter, there was a series of multiple choice questions, like bar type questions, MCQs, right? Which I told students I'm expecting them to do, and the answers were available in the online supplement. So I didn't spend time in class on the questions in the chapters because they had the answers already. And I thought I would be using some of the questions in the quizzes to rehearse, right? To reinforce materials. And I couldn't do it because I had students that didn't do the quizzes yet. So I have to figure that one out. So here's the thing. Lessons learned, there are not that many. One, No correlation. I was like, oh, I'm sure the students that waited until the last minute maybe are not the ones that did the best in the class. Zero correlation. Okay. Both on the exam performance and in the final course grade. So the top 6 students, the ones that scored the highest on the exams and got the final grade A, this is on a curve. So I was only allowed 6 students to get an A, right? They range from students that submitted the quizzes on time to those who were slightly late to those who submitted last minute. The 7 students that submitted all of the 3 quizzes after the review class and during the exam week, you see that there's a spread of grades, right? So I thought that doing the quizzes throughout the quarter will be good for their mental well-being and also set them up for better success in the exam. Cannot tell you that that's actually what's going on. In fact, quite a few students ended up using their second attempt to review, right? So they only did one, the quiz they did once. If they got the 9 or the 10, they were fine. They left it as is. They knew they always have the opportunity to do the second try. And if it scores higher, that's what's kept. So many students chose to do the second try, presumably, I'm interpreting it like that, right? Based on the dates, because let's say the first date was on time, and then the second date is towards the end of the quarter during review period or exam week, that they've used it also as review. So I have to think, how can I make it work better next year to give them the opportunity? Now, the final exam wasn't multiple choice questions, and they knew that, right? But still, many students use that, I guess, to review key concepts in the classroom, which I want to encourage. I think that's a good thing. So I have to think a little bit more how to revisit all of this for next year. So bottom line, would I do it again? I'm not sure. I'm actually thinking I may go back to firm due dates on those quizzes, and maybe bring in more elements of choice with some of the other stuff, maybe the things we're doing in the classroom or things that are not graded, but on things like that, which are also intended as a tool for me to see where my students are, especially in a larger classroom where, you know, it's easier to, right, to go unnoticed. I'm actually thinking I may put back the firm due dates on those quizzes, but I'd love to, you know, hear some thoughts and feedback from all of you. That is it for me for today. I think we're going to open it for questions, if there are any. I'm actually going to run the mic so we don't have to repeat it. Thank you.
So you have the spread of the ones who submitted late, and sort of, what about the grades that were at the bottom? So did the grades at the bottom also sort of spread between early submit and late submit?
Yes. Yeah, I had no, as I said, I couldn't see any direct correlation. Other questions?
Mary had a question.
Okay.
Could you see the results of the first attempt, even if they were later going to do a second attempt?
Yes. So in Canvas, I was able to see everything as soon as they submitted it. I actually saw that they didn't do the second one yet, and I could see how much time they had left. Timing wasn't an issue. Most of them finished it very quickly. But yes, I was able to see.
So I've got a couple random comments throughout. So one, the idea of the transparent assessment, I think that's something really important. And I'm going to try to integrate more of that, because I think especially with a with a fixed curve and grade inflation, it can be really difficult for students to figure out what an A looks like. So I want to give them very specific guidance for what an A historically looks like. It's not going to be a promise that, you know, with the curve, you can't always assess what it will look like. But on the topic of due dates, so I tried something different this semester, and I tried to basically let the class vote on what due dates would be and do it very democratically. My idea was that I would get a better idea about what other factors and stresses they had. And I was surprised that they were actually very responsible about the feedback that they gave me. So they didn't say we want 3 weeks for something. It was typically very close to what I would want for a due date. And I think for the most part that this was something that they appreciated. It let them feel like they had a real say in what was going on. And it ensured that they actually had enough time to get everything done. I will say on the flip side, there was probably 1 or 2 students that hated not knowing when everything would be due very early in the semester. So I don't expect that you can really please everyone all the time, but feedback from that experiment was that I liked it. I think most of the students liked it, and I'll probably keep doing that sort of democratic due date option for the future.
That's great. And I think on your point about transparent assignment design, that what I've used is the preceding year, if I had an A+ student, I asked them if I could use their paper as an example. And most likely they'll say yes. They want to share their work. They put so much effort into it. And of course, I redact the name and use that as an example of this is what an A+ research memo would look like. And it's been effective.
Yeah, I do the same. I post exemplars from like prior recent iterations of the class. And I usually will post like 2 or 3, and they seem to really appreciate that in sort of a, because I also, one of my writing assignments is kind of loose. I give them the choice of format. I'm like, I want you to do these 2 parts. And they kind of freak out. I'm like, IRAC's great, but you don't have to do IRAC. And so then I'll give them like, here's an example of 3 different ways that these are A papers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I will say kind of on this particular issue that over the years with the, yes, we give examples. Actually, with the sample memo, we have a version that's annotated so that they can actually see this is the C in the crack, and this is the I, and this is the right. So we are annotating it, and then we have to tell them, don't submit a memo that's annotated, right? But I've also learned, or at least I've decided that with some of the research papers or those final assignments, to actually give a spectrum, because sometimes if it's too good of a paper, and if you're not a native English speaker, sometimes the students freak out. It's like, I can't write it this way, right? This is like the perfect paper. I cannot write it this way. So I actually try to give them papers that on content and coherence and concision are good, right? They've earned full points, but they may not be perfect, right? So that it looks realistic to do the same. And then I forgot your question sorry, it wasn't a question for me. It was more of a comment on your sharing your experience. Thank you, I appreciate it.
I've also done, instead of a traditional research memo exercise, I'll do something that tries to mimic legal practice in a more meaningful way. I've done how to renew a domestic violence restraining order in my class. I do that every year. And students absolutely love doing that. And I have them, there's some California case law that's on the topic that they have to locate. There's a statute that they have to find. And then I ask them to find the relevant forms that they would need to effectuate that transaction. And students love it. And then the first assignment that I have them do is to find a circuit split. And so I have them, it's on aggressive panhandling. And if they, there's a circuit split on that issue, or at least there was until just recently. And I have them locate the circuits that have held that it's permissible and the circuits that have held that it's impermissible to restrict panhandling in a municipality. And it doesn't mimic a traditional memo, but it mimics a research task that is fairly commonly done. And it's not an assessment on their English, which is another important aspect to creating these assignments for LLM students, that we're not assessing them on their English ability. We're assessing them on their ability to, research effectively and apply what they've learned.
Can I take a prerogative and ask a question? Okay. I guess when you take a prerogative, you don't need to ask. But anyway, so actually, So my question was for you, David, especially on those last few points about the use of ChatGPT as a language learning platform or Grammarly or all of those tools. I've struggled with that because, again, I'm trying to, right? So on the one hand, in real life and in practice, no problem. We were talking about it in the earlier sessions around drafting with AI and all of that. But I've landed on telling my students, don't use it because I want to see where you are, right? Especially for our students that are planning to go and take the bar exam and then practice. I said, I'm okay with your English not being perfect. I'm not originally trained in the US. My English grammar is probably not according to most grammar rules, right? I speak it out loud, and that's how I decide where to put the commas. So I tell them, I don't care as much if your English is not perfect or your grammar is not perfect. I want to see your own voice and your own writing. But so I struggle with it because
I struggle with it too, and I'm a tech skeptic when it comes to generative AI. Really, overall, I think that a human tutor is going to be far better than ChatGPT will ever be in terms of teaching a student a second or third or additional language. The role that, and I would never recommend generative AI to any of my students as a writing tool. I do, however, suggest that they install Grammarly, because I use Grammarly myself to catch typos, and I found that students really find it an effective tool. I mean, I suppose there's some element of AI in Grammarly now, and students are using that and they're improving their writing with it, and so I bless their efforts there.
I mean, I will say that sometimes I have students, I mean, look, students who come to study here, if English is not their first language, have to meet a threshold of an English score, right? But we all know that those English tests vary greatly. And I agree with you completely. Most of our students are very sophisticated. Their reading comprehension, their listening is much better sometimes from spoken English. But sometimes I have students that clearly are struggling with English. And then I get very, very polished papers. Now, I had one student this year that struggled this entire year, and then I got an almost perfect, whether domestic violence is a basis for asylum in the US, an almost perfect paper. And I ran it through all of my tools, and I couldn't spot it. I couldn't pin it. So the student got a grade that objectively that paper warranted. I'm just not sure that it was the student's paper. Or at least it was enhanced, let's say that way. So I don't know. I mean,
well, I think I'm skeptical about the ability of those detection tools to actually identify content created by AI. I read recently that one of the tools identified the Declaration of Independence as being created by an AI platform. I take it with a grain of salt that one of those one of those checkers actually identifies something as being AI generated or not.
So aliens do exist.
Yes.
Okay. Do we have any other questions for us or questions from online? I can't see anyone on Zoom. Okay. Well, I guess we are giving you 10 minutes back.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much
I really
for joining us.
appreciate it.
Appreciate it.